Cool. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Kubernetes Cluster API Azure, our weekly office hours meeting. It is, I have to scroll down to find out, it is January 18th, 2024. We are, CapZ is a sub-project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle, which under that umbrella, we abide by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which I'm sure you all know basically boils down to let's try not to interrupt each other, use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and generally, let's make this as welcoming a place as we possibly can. At the beginning here, we provide some time for anyone who's new to introduce themselves and say why they're here. I'm going to assert that we don't have anyone new, so I'm going to skip that part. Yeah, so we can go ahead and move on to open discussion, and we don't have any. Oh, yes, we do have a topic. I'm not sure who's owning this one. Looks like it's
Oh, sorry, that
John.
was me.
So if you're ready, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thanks, Matt. So yeah, last week we had a bunch of really good discussion on the proposal to expose the entire AKS API service area from the CapZ API. And I think the conclusion that most of us came to is that there's really no good way to do that. So I did add a new option 5 to this proposal, which is we're not going to do anything new. So that's kind of the direction that the proposal is headed at the moment, and there hasn't been any feedback on it in the last week or so. So I would like to advocate that we start lazy consensus on this unless anybody has had a Jimmy Neutron brain blast in the last week or so for new ideas for this. Go ahead, Cecile.
Yeah, so I haven't, but I know that David Desar has, and I was chatting with him about it, and he's not there today, so I'll try to represent his spot. I think he commented on the PR as well, but I think essentially what he was advocating to me is that we should go for, instead of trying to change the way that CabZ exposes the API to the users in all circumstances, try to go for kind of like a hybrid approach where we keep with like what we have for now, but we allow this kind of like backdoor mechanism where the user can optionally go and define fields directly on the ASO resource if they are, in the process of testing something or trying to use a field that hasn't been exposed in CabZ directly yet. And then long term, their goal would be to, advocate for that field getting included either by opening an issue or a PR. So I don't know if this is already possible today. I think sort of technically is. I don't think we test for it though. I don't think that's like an official supported scenario that we document. Sorry, I also don't think it's like a great long-term approach because we don't want people like setting fields in two places, and it seems very hacky, but I think it's potentially slightly better than saying we're going to do nothing. But I think they're solving two different goals because I think your proposal was trying to solve, we want to make it easier for developers, like CabZ developers, to add support for new features and not have to do this over and over again and always play catch up. Whereas this proposal, I think that David has is more aiming towards like we want to enable users to, configure things that haven't been exposed yet in the CabZ API. Go ahead, John. Sorry, that was a long explanation.
No, yeah, that was good. So to your point about it is technically possible today, that is the case, where if you create an Azure Managed Control Plane and then let CabZ create the ASO managed cluster, then after that ASO resource is created, you can go ahead and poke that however you want, really. And unless CabZ has an opinion already about a specific field, it's just going to leave it alone. So if there is like a new feature that CabZ doesn't know about, you can still turn that on in your CabZ managed AKS cluster. The main issue with that Mike pointed out is that there's no way to declaratively specify that anywhere in YAML or anything like that, where you can just kind of spin up a CabZ cluster and be totally hands off and then let that new feature get enabled. Because there is still that step where you have to go ahead and tweak the resource after it gets created dynamically. So that's the main issue with that, but it's still possible. And then for the hybrid approach, I still feel like that would involve some degree of change like this, where we still have to somehow embed the whole ASO spec somewhere linked to the CabZ API. So if we don't have a good way to do that, then I'm not sure how we can declaratively enable the extra features stuff. Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, thanks again for managing this, John. So I actually had some, I'm speaking before I give context, but I had some trouble with what I'm thinking about reading your proposal. And now the way that you are just stating that in terms of what Mike is asking, John, brings us back to the forefront of my mind. And what I'm talking about is there are actually kind of two subtle, but I think distinct bits of automation that we're really talking about. And I think the proposal is largely speaking to the developer automation part of it. So sorry that I'm getting all the order around about what I'm talking about. I think that there is a developer automation story, which has to do with let's optimize the way that new AKS features, as they get rolled out, are automatically brought into the CabZ abstraction layer so that users can have an accelerated adoption story. So CabZ plus AKS users currently are always going to be faced with a situation, or at least the current architecture presents them with a situation where they're a little bit behind AKS, just like AKS and EKS and other managed services are a little bit behind Kubernetes. So it benefits those abstractions to reduce that latency so that the customers who are making a bet on that particular sort of more opinionated version of an underlying platform. So for us, it's like the cluster API opinionated version of AKS. So the folks who want to do that don't have to materially sacrifice the actual functionality that AKS provides just to get that preferential abstraction that cluster API provides. So I think that for me, as I'm reading the proposal, that's largely what we're talking about when we're gaming out the various proposals and weighing the pros and cons of each in relation to one another. The main sort of criterion that we're using to come to an opinion about which proposal is better is which is going to deliver that the most effectively, and it's going to be the easiest for us to implement and maintain going forward. But there's this other piece. So hopefully that made sense as like a discrete part of the automation we're trying to solve. Just we're trying to remove the whole thing now where, you know, in the sort of worst case scenario, human being manually goes and does some research, discovers some new AKS feature, or discovers an AKS feature that CabZ doesn't have, and then goes in and manually implements a PR like we do now to add that feature abstraction on top of AKS. And now CabZ users can use that particular AKS mode. So the other thing that I think we're talking about a little bit now when we refer to Mike's comment, and it's also in the proposal at times, and it was confusing to me to read the proposal and find out what are we exactly trying to solve here, is this notion that we might actually make AKS better for users, because AKS itself is faced with this problem for its user base. So AKS is continually rolling out features, whether they're like AKS features or whether they are the introduction of upstream Kubernetes features into the AKS support matrix. And so AKS has this problem itself where it needs to figure out how can we roll out features to users. And as far as my experience with using AKS as a user and as a developer is that almost all of that is in some way manual for the user. The user has to consume some sort of release notes, communication from the AKS service team, parse those, figure out what new features or change features or whatever, and then more or less intentionally decide how to then potentially evolve their configuration matrix on their fleet of clusters to reflect this new opportunity that the new release of AKS has. So then So if for example, AKS releases something like dedicated hosts, a user is going to have to manually figure out how to use that feature. Their existing clusters aren't going to like automatically convert over. I mean, this is not controversial what I'm saying, but I want to be super clear that I think that there is this part of this proposal discussion that involves using the power of cluster API to make a more automated AKS. So it's actually for CAPZ users of AKS, they would actually get better automated feature rollout into their existing cluster fleet compared to AKS. So it turns into like a net positive value proposition in terms of a user weighing, am I going to use AKS or am I going to use AKS fleet or am I going to use CAPZ plus AKS? If we were to solve this, if we were to deliver a solution that had a reliable way of continually keeping AKS clusters that are running on CAPZ up to date in particular feature across particular features, or scooping in new features as appropriate so that it becomes more of a hands-off experience from a cluster maintenance point of view. That would be, so the reason I bring this up is because I would like to clarify that the proposal that you've been gaming out, John, is more that former thing. It's more about figuring out how we as a CAPZ community can better serve our user base who wants the latest AKS features and doesn't want to have to wait 3 months, 6 months for particular features. And I wonder if we decide on an option 5, in that context, we can open up a new proposal, or we can consider a new proposal with input from our user base about the other potential way of automating, which is how can we actually leverage the Power Cluster API? So, you know, to do the sort of automated cluster rollout plus new feature adoption thing. Like maybe there's some magic there that's going to really address what customers are looking for in this story. Yeah, I'll shut up because that was a long time, and my kids are in here.
Cecile.
Oh, sorry, I was actually going to ask you to talk again, Jack. I think I need a bit
You
of
may do that.
clarification. I'm a bit confused about where. So what you're saying is that CAPZ would enable users to automatically adopt new features as they're released, and I don't really see or can you clarify what we mean by adopt here? Like, are we talking about a scenario where a feature is turned on by default? And so by them bumping the version of CAPZ, when reconciliation happened, that feature gets turned on. And in that case, that would be pretty rare, I would assume, because I think most features that land, most new features are usually off by default, or some, like the intention is not that things are going to happen to your cluster without you intentionally opting in. So I guess which part of adoption are we talking about here?
It's I'm trying to create a subtle distinction, which I don't think we have done concretely. But as I was reading John's proposal, I feel like I was at times encountering this sort of ladder, this other thing that you're talking about, Cecile, which I agree is not well defined, but something along the lines of like automatic adoption features that's distinct from giving the user an ability to upgrade their version of Cluster API or upgrade their version of CAPZ and get all the latest AKS features more quickly. So basically, the two distinctions are what we're doing now, but with much more efficiency, versus actual new foo, where a user can take a more hands-off approach with their CAPZ clusters and use the automation that CAPI provides to do like automated like feature upgrade rollout across, something to the effect of like how auto upgrade works with AKS, but more general, so across more features. I'm not defining what that would look like and how we would do that and which features that would be appropriate for, but I'm wondering if that's a different conversation that is perhaps more what users are actually looking for. Go ahead, John. Maybe did I answer your question, Cecile? Not really.
Sort of. I'd be good to get an example, even if we're not defining it, but maybe I'll let John speak first.
Right. I mean, I think an example might be moving from one deprecated VM SKU to another across your clusters in a rolling upgrade kind of way. So if AKS, I mean, and this might be entirely artificial, but if AKS were to promote certain SKUs over others in its underlying infrastructure, I know we deprecate various like vertical CPU types sometimes, like whether it's a GPU SKU or something else like that. So I can imagine that as being an example where there is a way, as AKS promotes one SKU over another or deprecates it, that that the way that it works for an AKS user now is that they know that they have like with new clusters, they can't create VMs, they can't create clusters with nodes of a certain type any longer, but now they might be running 100 clusters that have that old SKU on it. And so something like that might be something that CAPI could improve over the vanilla AKS experience, where it could do a rolling upgrade across those just on the VM SKU. The remaining configuration stays the same. Maybe that's not a great example, but that's off the top of my head.
John?
Sorry, John, go ahead.
Yeah, so Jack, would you mind going through the proposal and just noting where that's not clear? Because I guess that's not like the intention of the proposal at all. I mean, the proposal is mostly
Yeah.
just make it so that users can tweak anything, but not sort of do any tweaking by CAPZ itself. So if you could go through the proposal and note those places, I would love to kind of chuck that out of scope for the moment, for this proposal anyway.
Great.
Sorry, can I jump in, Matt?
Yes.
I think what Jack is saying is not that the proposal is confusing with that respect, but more that this maybe might be the right problem to solve, as opposed to the problem we're trying to solve now, or maybe an additional problem to solve.
Well, that is actually true, Cecile. That is the subtle point that I may be making, is that is. I mean, I think what I'm observing from the proposal, and what a lot of us are observing, is that solving the primary problem is really hard, because we're faced with many abstraction layers downstream that are doing it a different way. They're not automating this for us. They're moving forward with discrete vNext APIs. We're having to consume them. We don't know what those vNext APIs are going to represent as a delta in relation to the current API. So doing all of that automation work is very, very non-trivial without compromising reliability for customers. The sort of manual way, what you sacrifice in automation, you benefit from reliability, like predictability, all that kind of thing. But also, yeah, maybe there's a different story that allows us to introduce different types of automation that are actually more beneficial, more cluster API idiomatic, more gives the AKS user community more of a sort of interesting feature matrix to compare CAPZ plus AKS versus Fleet, whatever. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, this is good stuff. I tried to summarize obviously everything here, but please let me know if I got it wrong. So let me just kind of restate it to make sure I got mostly what you're saying. There's sort of two focuses here. And the first one is obviously we want to minimize latency between new AKS features being available and the time that CAPZ can provide them. And then sort of and really that's the overall goal, I think, of this proposal and everything we've been talking about with AKS automation. And then you're talking about, hey, here's actually more value we could add potentially on top of this by smoothing out what by necessity the service has to provide new features, but generally say this is off by default because they don't want to break the world for people. Whereas CAPZ has the opportunity to be opinionated about things. And I really think this is a lot of our value. And so if there's some new AKS feature that seems like a big win, and we know we can turn it on safely, we can just do so. As well as, things that hopefully AKS is telling us, like you need to move from this SKU to another SKU or something theoretical like that. So is that roughly what you're saying? Those are kind of the two prongs of
Yeah, basically. I mean, thank you for taking notes. I would say it's not more of a solution, it's just a different solution.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm thinking without solutionizing a CAPC specific CRD that would declare forward progress, feature evolution, declarative config that you could then apply to a fleet of clusters that you're managing. Something
Yeah.
like that. Cecile?
I think, Jack, your point is really important in that what it highlights, in my opinion, related to this proposal is that this is yet another reason for not doing option 1 and 2, and whichever ones we're like delegating to ASO. Because if we were to do that, then we kind of take away the opportunity to do this in the future, right? Where we can be opinionated about certain features. In terms of like going back to John's original question of are we ready for lazy consensus? I feel like the answer is no, just because there's so much discussion that's active still. And I know it's been slow, but I think this is a really, really important, critical part of our design. So I think it's important that we take the time it takes. But I don't think we're ready to implement any of the options like you've highlighted, John. And perhaps for now, option 5 is the status quo. But I don't think we're, maybe the right answer right now is to take a step back. I don't know, but I don't think we're ready to just close the proposal and call it done. I think it might be worth exploring an option 6, which we haven't thought of yet, or haven't, at least I haven't. I don't know if you have, but of trying to do something that is not, using the ASO types embedded or anything like that, but maybe some sort of like auto generation or like code generation of the API so that we still have to add them, in PRs and manually, but we ease the flow for developers, right? So that it's not like repetitive work every time. So it's maybe like another option to put out there. I don't know if there's any, way like we'd have to play with it.
Sorry, can I go next? I actually wasn't done.
Oh, sorry, Matt.
If that's all right, before I forget what I was going to say, which maybe I've done already.
You're late.
No.
Just
So I'm glad you brought the focus back to the proposal and John's specific question, but just back out on the previous tangent. All I was going to say, Jack, is if we were to get to the point where CAPC is, I would argue, providing additional value by being opinionated about AKS upgrades, that still kind of puts the burden on us as maintainers to be pretty aggro about finding out about the new features, determining whether we want to turn them on by default and all that. So it still implies it makes it hard to imagine how everything can be totally automated, because it's going to require us to be opinionated, and therefore, you see what I'm saying? That's the only.
Yeah, I do see what you're saying. I'm really describing a different kind of automation that would not a developer automation, but automation in the service of the user delight, of user benefit. So it might involve the user. A user might have to say something like, if you see any clusters running this VM SKU, do a rolling upgrade to this SKU instead. So a user would have to do that. But the relatively small cost of that declarative configuration gesture would yield massive benefits depending on the set of clusters that would benefit from that. And again, I'm using that a simple example, especially because it leverages a core CAPI functionality rolling upgrade, which is already highly configurable. So I'm just trying to describe a scenario where we are marrying CAPI native automation primitives with AKS in a way that makes everything better. It's sort of like, oh wow, AKS on CAPC makes perfect sense because you can do these sort of amazing things naturally.
Yeah, I can see how in theory a lot of automation might make that much easier for us. At the very end, though, we're still going to have to decide about individual new things that show up. So I'm just saying it requires us to be maybe even more invested than we are in swimming upstream towards AKS, but that's probably a good outcome in the end. That makes sense. Anyway, go ahead,
for
Noise.
Sure. I had the same thought as Matt had. Like being opinionated about the features we are going to consume for in CAPZ would again add the burden of, well, we are not truly automating it. So I thought the initial proposal itself was we'll consume AKS as is. But looks like there are different opinions right now.
Cool. Where are we at? So back to your basic question, John. I agree with Cecile personally. We're probably not quite ready for lazy consensus. If it sounds like. Do other people have opinions? Do we have anything else to say about this, or?
Nope, that was all I had. Thank you, everybody, for the discussion.
Yeah, it's good stuff. All right, nothing else on the agenda, but I assume we should start talking about the release. See where we're at, right? Does my audio sound okay? It sounds all crackly on my side.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, good. So I think this is where we're at, right? It seems like there's they've still got a little more work to do on all 3 PRs, so they probably didn't quite make it. Is that we have agreement on that? Should I move them to the next milestone?
Yeah, I think the first two also got rebase or merge conflicts from yesterday's merges, unfortunately.
True, at least one of them looks like still has.
Yeah.
Oh well, I hope this doesn't demotivate them, because I know they did a lot of work at the end here, but seems like
Did we
not ready.
merge Fleet last night?
Yep.
Sorry, not Fleet. Did we merge? No, there was a different one I was reviewing.
Oh,
You mean
The
marketplace?
Extensions.
extensions, yes. Did that merge last night?
No.
Oh, Willie's here. Hey, Willie, what's up?
Hey, sorry, I joined a little late. Yeah, it's still there's a test flake, and also I don't think it's approved or LDTM and yet, so it might be able to get in if there aren't any big changes requested today. So it's pretty much ready for another look, I think, from everyone.
well,
And I think John addressed your comment from yesterday. Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
well, I don't, go ahead, Cecile. You raised your hand.
I think unless it's getting in the next hour, it's not going to go in for the release because we need to start cutting the release like this morning.
Yes.
It takes a while to go through all the process. So unless we're waiting for just literally the pra merge and it's just finishing up tests, I think we probably have to punt it.
Okay, yeah, it's probably not gonna make it then. That's fine. I think it's better not to rush it because I think it needs a closer look. So, yeah.
I would agree, unless someone has a specific argument. I think we're at release point right now. Cecilia, have more to say?
Oh no, sorry, just didn't lower my hand.
Oh, no worries. Okay. So if everybody's cool with that, I think we're ready for release at this point. Nothing else to merge. So then how do we want to do it? This is the first time we get to use Cecile's groovy new PR automation. And you were talking the other day about we should do that together so that knowledge can be passed on. Does that still work for you?
Yeah, so I mean the notes, ideally the doc would be enough. Like if I have to sit there in the meeting, then I mean I probably didn't do enough good job of writing good docs. But I think whoever is going, basically we need one person to volunteer to open PRs and then everyone else to review. The first PR I think we need to open is the adding the metadata YAML thing. And then the second one will be the release notes. So I guess I think I shouldn't be the one to do that because I want to make sure someone else gets the chance to try it out. ideally someone who's not a maintainer so that we can test this theory that this allows non-maintainers to do releases. But yeah, go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, I agree. Those are the two important parts. So it shouldn't be you, and it shouldn't be a maintainer. So yeah, someone who fulfills those two
Wants to be
requirements should be
voluntold.
the one to do and ideally, I think that the durable way to do this going forward is for one person to drive it. And so I would say let's pick one volunteer, link to the release doc, and then just go. And then that naivety is actually super beneficial because that will really stress test the process, including the documentation, because we want that to be, I know we don't want to be targeting that particular scenario every single release, but we want to be able to accommodate that scenario any particular release. Any particular release, we want a non-maintainer of the community to be able to independently release, with obviously with help from the various approvers to approve PRs. But I don't think it necessarily has to be a pairing process. That can,
Yeah. Noah's volunteered. Thanks, Noah's. I will be on the lookout for, like, if you need anything, ping me. And I just sent the doc to the chat, but I can send it to you in Slack also if you want.
I opened it
Thanks,
up.
Noah's. Noah's volunteers. Yeah, I'm also basically available for this the majority of the day. The only other thing I'm working on is an image builder thing. So if you want to pair with me or if you need help, you can ping me as well. But thank you very much. Hopefully it goes smoothly. All right. The plan is to wrap that up today. Nothing else on the discussion agenda. Does anybody else have anything to bring up? We should also do patch releases in the patch branches. I can just do that if you don't want to be randomized, Nawaz, unless you want to do all three tasks. Yeah, go ahead, Jack.
my recollection is that we need actually that person to do the patch releases too, because it's part of the release documentation. There are various, like, if you're doing a minor release, do this. If you're doing a patch release, so I think we need to test that the documentation is good to go for both. Is that right, Cecile?
Yeah, we've already done the patch releases through this automation, so it's not as much of a risk. So I don't think it's a huge deal if Matt or someone else does it. But yes, they're all using this new doc. They can be done in parallel.
David, you raise your hand.
Yeah, sorry, I just got my internet back. I wanted to see the discussion on the auto feature. What was that covered in the notes there, or?
Yeah, I tried to summarize it.
Yes.
Let me just wrap up the release thing real quick, and then we can pivot back to that if we want. So I'm happy to do the patch releases. I agree it's not as critical as the minor release, but it's totally up to you, Nawaz, whether you want to handle the whole thing or there's probably chat going on that I'm not looking at.
Yep. Cool. I'll reach out in case we just get started on reading the release notes or release documentation.
So you're going to try and do the minor and the patches, or okay?
Both of them.
Just please let us know
I
if
think
you
let's
need.
just split it. It will be easier. Or sorry,
That
unless
works
you have
out.
strong desire to do all three, Noah's, I think it will be easier to just focus on that one and then just do them in parallel.
Okay. I mean, I'm okay with splitting as well, so either works.
All right, I'll do the patches and you could do the minor, because the patches, I know it's pretty trivial. So, all right, that's a plan. Back to you, David.
Okay. Yeah, I read the notes there. I think the thing that is the challenge, right? Is with the hybrid is if somebody were to just leave it as is and just try and spin up ASO, AKS definition and apply it on their own, one, that is quite a bit of work. And then two, it's any changes to CAP-Z, then you now have to modify the ASO definition as well, if you're just pushing the whole definition, right? And so I think that's where it becomes unwieldy, right? And I'm wondering if there's any other alternatives that could be possible to help perhaps with automation of whatever, conversion to ASO specs are. And I don't know, there's just wondering if there's anything else there that's possible, because right, most of the options that are currently in the spec are just more of you specify that all the entire ASO template and then just it's wrapped in some variation, right?
Jack?
John, do you want to respond to that first?
Sure. So I guess I'm still not totally sure what our path is to like strike a balance between like CAP-Z having control over the spec, like the CAP-Z spec, but also getting all of the features all at once from ASO. It seems like, because it seems like that's kind of what we have right now, and automating that sort of logic seems dicey to me. Like I think there's a lot that could go wrong, and it would probably end up overall being a lot more work than what we do right now. So I guess those are my initial thoughts. Go ahead, Jack.
Cool. Yeah, David, I wanted to respond to your remark about a user modifying the ASO spec itself directly. How can we not let that happen? I feel like one of the things that's developed, at least in my mind over these conversations, is that that's just not a good idea. We didn't have that with our previous SDK, and that wasn't a objective of migrating from a traditional, Golang SDK wrapping to ASO. We didn't, at least I'm not aware that we set out to allow that kind of additional out of band configuration. So how can we just walk away from that entirely? And I mean, we can surely tell users not to do it, but maybe we can consider actually locking that down with some kind of service account so that users can't do that. Because I don't think that there's a good way to enable that.
So what you're suggesting is that today it's actually possible to, like, let's say you have, I'm just logically how you would do this today. I provision a CAP-Z AKS cluster. I then could go and use the ASO CTL tool to, from the ARM API, extract the equivalent ASO YAML definition of that cluster, right? Then I now have the YAML. I could then go apply that YAML to that cluster, the same management cluster where ASO and CAP-Z is at. And now you've got basically two management reconciliation controllers basically on the machine, where you have two definitions. You have the full ASO one being applied, and you have the actual CAP-Z one being applied. So what you're suggesting is that is a bad scenario, period, and that should just not ever be done.
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's actually, I think it's easier than what you're describing. It's more like now that we have ASO in the cluster, a user can literally just do some very simple kubectl discovery and be like, oh, I want that AKS feature foo. Look through the, say, Azure Managed Control Plane, Azure Managed Machine Pool, whatever. Look through the CAP-Z CRD, look through the CAP-Z docs and conclude, dang, I don't see foo anywhere. I can't use foo. But oh, but there's this ASO resource on my cluster, on my management cluster, and I see foo. Foo's there. I'm gonna set foo to true, and then the cluster gets foo, and we're like, great. wow, that's awesome. Now I enabled foo. And that'll work so long as CapZ doesn't know about foo, as we've discussed before, because every pure CapZ reconciliation of that ASO resource is going to be completely, well, actually, might not be true. The point is that it's super complicated to make those two things work well together when CapZ doesn't know about foo. So we talked about this irrespective of like new features when we were first rolling out ASO, that like now we're going to have this actual mutable resource on the management cluster, which a user can theoretically modify, and the outcomes, the sort of long-term goal state outcomes with respect to CapZ during its next reconciliation become unknown at that point. So we were like, we don't want to do that, but we concluded that locking it down with the service account was either overkill or out of scope at the time. And so now during this conversation, we've actually considered ways in which we can leverage the fact that ASO has a broader surface area feature-wise than CapZ to maybe accelerate the rollout of AKS features to CapZ customers using AKS. And I'm saying, I think that now is the time to say we shouldn't ever allow that. And we should consider locking that down with the service account. So users can't just simply kubectl edit their ASO resource and think they're partying in new AKS feature land. They need to open up an issue with that, or we need to solve that a different way. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I guess one maybe easier, at least short-term alternative to like locking it down security with security mechanisms is to just have CapZ overwrite any user change, because we could just nil out the whole spec and build it from scratch every single time. And then if CapZ can also watch the ASO resources, then pretty much as soon as a user tweaks it, we can just overwrite it right away. That is also a path we could take that I think would achieve that same end.
Yeah, and that we might have to do that. I think that we have allowed ourselves the flexibility by not doing that of a scenario where we're automatically consuming new ASO versions without having to have a corresponding revision of CapZ. And so the idea there, right, John, is that as long as we can positively identify the CapZ known delta between itself and the ASO properties that it cares about, as long as there's no delta there, then theoretically we should be able to move forward with new versions of the ASO resource. I mean, the problem is, go ahead, someone.
So there's no, just because I think that there's a fundamental thing here I want to make sure I think we're all on the same page of. It's short of like there's basically no reasonable way, it sounds like, from what I heard from you, Jack, to basically patch in an automated fashion the delta, right? Even if somebody had and said, I want foo, and it's like 3 lines of YAML, and I want that's the code that lights up foo on the ASO definition for AKS, like that's, and we were to, let's say, theoretically wrap that in a little chunk of what CapZ is allowing, that just under the hood, there's no way reasonably to make that work in a way that we would feel good about.
I agree with the last clause of the sentence, feel good about. There are ways to do that. Do you agree with that, John?
I mean, that's kind of how things are designed to work right now, is that like that is a known thing we've thought about before, where like if a user wants to tweak something on the ASO resource, they are free to do that, and we're going to let them keep it. And we have some tests explicitly for that. So I guess enabling that wouldn't be any more work today, at least.
I think we encounter this with other downstream resources, not just even AKS, in various CapZ controller flows, where there will be something downstream in the data model that we don't recognize, and we as we discover those scenarios, we then have to have manual sort of defensive logic in our controllers to be able to accept that. I mean, it's a case by case scenario, but for example, let's say a downstream service introduces a new feature and now it's enabled, and now CapZ decides to enable that. We need to expect that when we need to expect to be able to encounter that and sort of have these conditions where it's like, well, is it already enabled? If it is, then I'm not going to fall back to my default opinionated flow, because I need to anticipate that this thing has a longer life cycle than I don't want to. It's hard to describe this, but the point is that we already encounter this, but we don't have a general solution for this. Having a general solution is really, really hard. I would say having a general solution is maybe not possible. It's if we were to introduce into the user contract an expectation that this was the norm, that you're going to get a fast acceleration of new feature adoption from these downstream from CapZ abstractions, then what that means from the CapZ development point of view is that as we roll new CapZ versions, we will have to do really thorough testing against all these new versions to make sure that our controllers can deal with every sort of possible permutation that may be ahead of our like data model representation of those downstream resources. Hopefully this is making sense. I've never expressed this, so I don't know if it's coming out. But and that actually, in terms of developer automation, in terms of enabling us to release new CapZ versions quickly that expose these features to users, is potentially actually a net negative, because doing that validation, making sure that from CapZ version to CapZ version, we are releasing safe, reliable, backwards compatible software for our customers actually might be harder and more manual in order to safely accommodate all of that sort of permissive automation that we're just letting play out. If that makes sense.
Well, right. And that's why I was saying I don't think that the actual let's just say that you did have this allow a patch chunk of ASO code that you automatically apply. If that were a feature, I would just say that is never in a case where a user should expect that is just going to be as stable as everything else. And there's not going to be all the tests. There's not going to be all these crazy regression combination things like you talk about. It just that's not going to be there, right? Like we need probably a general use case of like some feedback mechanism if like we try to apply that ASO and then it bombs out, and be like, yep, we don't know we don't, like some general catch-all, but like there's no way we would be able to reasonably, I agree, test all those use cases. It's kind of like a permanent, use as as necessary type of thing, right? Just as a stopgap. Because if we were to allow some kind of patch versus just the full-blown ASO, then you actually have, and that's even possible today, right? Like I could deploy a CapZ cluster, get the ASO YAML from the tool, I could enable foo, right? And then get the ASO YAML again, do the delta, and say that's the code I want to automatically apply with my patch definition, right? Like with CapZ, if that were theoretically a feature, right? And then and that way it would, I don't know. I mean, I agree, like it's the stability and all those other things are not going to be the same, and that's understandable. On comments from maybe John, I'd like to hear from John.
Yeah, so the patches thing is interesting so are you saying like in the CapZ spec we would have a field called patches or something, and then those are just like raw JSON patches that CapZ would kind of apply. So CapZ would have like its opinionated feature set, and then also some patches that are essentially whatever the user wants, however, to change the ASO resource. And CapZ kind of throws those onto the back end.
Yeah, exactly. It just kind of applies whatever you tell it should apply, and then we don't do like I said, we don't do any kind of crazy error checking, whatever. Like if a person bonks the YAML or the YAML doesn't exist, or whatever, like we just, you know, we say up that your YAML's messed up or whatever it is, right? We don't do any kind of all crazy end-to-end tests and all that other stuff. Like we just do one general, like, does it apply it or not? And if it doesn't, then spit back an error and that's it, right? And then that way, like, because the thing is like that way it actually has the possibility to work if you want to apply it to 3, 4, 5, 6 clusters, or if you want to change your CAPZ definition, like it's going to continue to work and you don't have to regenerate the full ASO definition every single time.
Yeah, I think that's definitely worth throwing in the doc. I will add that.
Cool. Have we, this is a deep and fascinating topic, as Jack was saying in the chat. Have we beat it to death for today? We're just about out of time. Okay. Cool. I think that's it for today, unless anybody has anything else to add. Cecile, are you going to be here next week, or can I hassle you now?
I'll be here next week.
Okay. All right, let's call it good for today. And Nawaz and I will start working on the releases. And thanks for all the work everybody contributed. This is a pretty big release. Hopefully it goes smoothly, and we'll see you all next week. Same time, same place.
Cool, thank you.
Bye, thanks,
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Matt.
Matt. Thanks for the great
Thanks,
notes.
Matt.
See ya.
Thanks.